Order. Could I call the committee to order and ask everyone present to note the register of members' interests where the interests of members of this committee are noted? And could I welcome our witnesses today as part of our ongoing inquiry into counterterrorism and the counter-narrative? Obviously, the issue that's been in the public domain at the moment has been about your tax from your companies. This committee is not concerned about this because you will be giving evidence to our sister committees next week. But just as an opening question, Dr. House, do you have anything to add to the statements that have been made publicly by your company on this issue?
No, Chair, thank you. I'd simply say thank you for having me here to discuss the important counter-terrorism work that we are doing, and repeat that two of my colleagues who are experts in tax will be appearing before the Public Accounts Committee next week. You've
just become the largest company in the world, I understand, last night, with a turnover bigger than Norway, Austria and Colombia. Congratulations.
Thank you.
As far as Facebook is concerned, there was a report in the Times today that you all had set aside $2 billion to settle your global tax bill, but it doesn't include the United Kingdom.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to the committee. I'm aware of that news report, as you are, and such speculation in the media. Unlike other companies, Facebook has not made a statement about this, so I'm unable to help you further, other than to say...
Will you be giving evidence to public accounts as well?
We've not been invited to give evidence to the Public Accounts Committee, but I would just say that, like all large companies, where we have tax team who are in regular contact with tax authorities about our affairs in countries where we operate. And those are complex matters and ones that I've not come here prepared to answer your
questions.
questions.
Will you be giving evidence to public accounts?
So we haven't been invited to give evidence to that committee, but as Simon says, we agree with all local tax laws, and I haven't prepared that issue for this committee, but happy to
Okay, good. So we've dealt with that. Let us now move on to counter-terrorism. We had evidence in our inquiry from Mark Rowley, who's the head of counter-terrorism for the Metropolitan Police, and indeed David Anderson, who is the independent assessor for the government on counter-terrorism. Both expressed concern that when they have approached your companies, and each one of you can answer these questions, even though we directed to one witness, you will have been less than helpful in respect of handing over information on counter-terrorism. In particular, Mark Rowley said, and he used these phrases, that some internet firms were deliberately undermining counter-terrorism investigations, refusing to hand over potential evidence, or threatening to tip off suspects, preferring to protect customer privacy. Dr. House, do you think that criticism is fair?
I think it's certainly a fair issue to bring up. We have a long history of working together with government and with law enforcement authorities to ensure that they have the information they need to pursue investigations. Our cooperation is obviously governed under both UK and US law, but we do our best to make sure that we can provide information in the case of investigations. In Google's case, we have long published statistics about our interactions with law enforcement authorities. For the UK, there have obviously been an increasing number of requests for information from us. I think it's gone up from 1,200 in the first half of 2013 to about 3,000 in the first half of last year.
So you've had 3,000 requests for information from the authorities?
Yes.
What about Facebook?
It's actually a similar number for each half year in the last few years, 3,000 to 4,000 in the UK. And the UK is one of the highest. But just to be clear, that's about all manner of things, not just counter-terrorism. But the expert team that we have and the company that works in these spaces would confirm that there has been an increase in the number of requests we've had on counter-terrorism.
In the first half of 2015, we received 299 account information requests. And I think one of the things that reflects is that Twitter's a public platform. So actually, you can look at a Twitter account without even having a Twitter account yourself. So there's a huge amount of information available without having to ask us directly.
Mr. Pickles, you understand our concern when the head of counter-terrorism says that you're undermining efforts. He didn't name the companies, but he talked generally of internet companies. And he went on to talk about people being tipped off. In fact, David Anderson, in his report published in June of 2015, said this: some service providers will tip off a customer that they are under surveillance unless persuaded not to do so, typically by a court order. Have you all tipped off customers that they are under surveillance?
Well, let me be absolutely clear. I think this is an issue where some of the media reporting hasn't helped form a good understanding of policy.
Sure, that's why you're here. You're here
absolutely,
so that you don't have to rely on Twitter
and
or the media. You can actually tell us, have you tipped off customers that they are under surveillance?
And so the first question is, are they under surveillance? We're not part of that discussion.
Sure.
Where a specific request for user data is made to our company, under many jurisdictions around the world, there are legal frameworks that exist to provide notice to that user. Now, one of the things that we are very clear about, and reading the transcript of when David Anderson spoke to this committee, he actually said he wasn't aware of any circumstances where the situation Mr. Rowley outlined had occurred. But we
written to him since his appearance and reminded him of what he said in June 2015, that actually he did say this in his report. So what you're saying is you'll do tip people off, but you have to do so because if the UK authorities ask you for certain information, there are other jurisdictions in the world where you have to tell the customer. What you're saying?
Let me be clear. In the US and other jurisdictions, there is a legal framework which provides for certainty. Our policy is very clear. We seek to provide user notice, and I'll quote directly from our policy, exceptions to prior notice may include exigent or counterproductive circumstances. So we work with law enforcement on a case-by-case basis to make sure that we do not disrupt those investigations you're discussing.
But you've not been clear, you've been slightly more complicated. Thank you, Mr.
Well, because
you're right. We just want a simple answer. If a UK authority, like the head of counterterrorism, says we would like this information, are you duty bound by either your policy or the law of another country to actually tell that user that this information has been requested? It is a yes or a no.
Well, so no. By our policy, we allow ourselves to not notify a user where it is counterproductive. So we do not have
So it's
to
a double
give
negative.
We would like to tell users, but we do not have
So you
to.
have not told users that this information has been requested. You never tell users.
No, we do tell users, and it's content
You've
specific.
contradicted yourself, Mr. Pickles.
It's context specific. If let's say, for example, the police request information pertaining to a journalist or a member of parliament, we would seek to give notice because in that case it's reasonable to do so.
So if the police ask
counterterrorism investigation, it wouldn't be.
Sorry, just very slightly slow. We've got plenty of time, so don't worry. If it's an MP or a journalist that the authorities have requested information about, you would tell those people.
Again, it depends on the investigation. If it was counterterrorism...
But you just said that you would tell them.
Well, again, I said it's context specific. There are certain roles where it may be more reasonable to give user notice than others.
We understand the word reasonable because we're lawmakers and therefore we have to deal with these words all the time. I'm just asking you for facts, Mr. Pickles. Do you tell people other than journalists and MPs that the authorities have asked for information?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, are you in the same position that you, in effect, tip off people and tell them when information is requested?
We don't do it in the UK.
Do you do it in America?
Yes, sometimes, but not in every case. And we have and it does depend somewhat on rules in the particular jurisdiction, and indeed it's a matter before the Investigatory Powers Joint Committee looking at exactly this issue.
Sure, and I'm
but
sure
in the
we'll
UK,
come on to that.
In the UK we don't do it, and even if we could, we would never do it in respect of counter-terrorism cases.
Yes, so if Mr. Rowley or someone else like him says, we want this information, it's a terrorism investigation, you would never inform the user. You just hand over the information. If it came within a criteria...
If it met our criteria, we review every case on a case-by-case basis, but we would not be tipping someone off.
Thank you. So it's a yes from Nick Pickles, yes from Twitter, it's a definite no from Facebook in the UK, but in America it's different. We accept that and we understand that. What is the situation with Google, Dr. House?
We're in the same situation as Facebook, where it is jurisdiction dependent. Obviously, we follow the law in the jurisdictions where we operate, but where it is not prohibited, we and where disclosing is appropriate in the context of an investigation, we will.
Now, in respect to taking down items that are on the internet, we've also received a lot of evidence over the last few months, and indeed in our previous report, that person-to-person radicalisation has been replaced by radicalisation and grooming on the net. Therefore, the internet companies are obviously important in that context. We've also had evidence that in 289 days, groups like Anonymous and Ghost Security have taken down or reported 2,555 websites and reported 19,568 Twitter pages and reported 40,000 suspected terrorist materials in total on the internet. Do you have figures, Dr. House, as to the number of websites that you all have taken down that you all deem to be websites that propagate terrorism?
So we don't break out our removals by the specific criteria on which we remove them. I think it's probably worth stepping back and putting it into context where we obviously operate YouTube, which is a video platform for sharing information, and we also operate a search engine. In the case of YouTube, where we are hosting the materials and we set community guidelines that set the rules of the road of what's acceptable, we've had a zero-tolerance approach to terrorism for years. We first put up a flagging option for terrorist content in 2008, and we have adapted our policy over time to take into account new ways that people are abusing the platform to make sure that zero-tolerance policy is actually put into effect well.
So how many have you taken down in total?
So on the YouTube side, we receive about 100,000 flags a day.
Right.
But that's across all types of use. A day.
In the UK?
No, globally. 2014 is the last year for which we have numbers, but we've removed 14 million videos from YouTube in 2014. Again, that's across all types of abuse.
Are you able to be more specific in future? Would you be able to look at the number of websites and the number of items that have a terrorism content?
Yeah, so
are you able to do that?
So we're not able to do it right now. We're certainly open to, and we're actively thinking about ways that we can be more transparent about what we remove and what rules it violates. It's worth noting, though, that one of the reasons it's difficult is because if somebody is offended by something on YouTube, they go into our flagging procedure. And lots of those flags overlap. So they could flag for terrorist content, but the same video they might flag for hate speech or incitement to violence. And those are all slightly different. So at present, we're not able to count that way, but it is something that we are keen to think about how we can do a better job.
And now, Mr. Milner, your boss, Sheryl Sandberg, was pretty critical a few days ago about what was the content on the net. She said that she felt that it had become a place where hate was being disseminated. Is that right?
Absolutely.
What prompted Sheryl Sandberg to say that, and how many pages or profiles has Facebook taken down, for example, in the last year, relating specifically to counterterrorism?
Can I take the first part of your question first around what prompted Sheryl Sandberg to say that, and then I'll take the second part around data. So what prompted it was the announcement of an initiative called the Online Civil Courage Initiative, which was announced a couple of weeks ago in Berlin, a joint initiative with actually two UK-based organisations, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and the Institute for Countering Violent Extremism, the ICSR, the Institute for the Study of Research into Countering Violent Extremism, the ICSR, based at King's College. And this is an initiative which will combine support for NGOs that are trying to use the internet for counter-speech and a counter-narrative, some research into what works, and then training around best practice. So what Sheryl said was part of that.
Why did Sheryl Sandberg suddenly say this after all these years?
Absolutely wasn't sudden, Chairman. This was something that, as a company, we've taken very seriously for a number of years. But of course, as events in the world have unfolded in recent years, and this has become probably the number one public policy issue that I talk about with governments across the many countries that I cover, as well as the UK, this has just risen up the policy agenda, and I'm sure you'd agree that that's been the same for yourselves. And so it's risen up our agenda as well. And what we want to do is to ensure that we are learning from organisations that work on the ground, from the best academic researchers, and we're providing the best support. And so it's absolutely a demonstration of concern.
Are you going to publish the outcomes of the initiative?
Absolutely. This is a 3-year-long initiative. and there will be more to follow. Can I take that? Do you want me to cover the second part of your question? We don't provide the same level of detail as yet as Google do around Takedown. So we provide similar information around the requests we get from governments, but at the moment we don't provide public data on the number of pieces of content or accounts that we take down.
And finally from you, Mr. Pickles, on this. The Turkish government has just fined Twitter $50,000 for refusing to remove what it considers terrorist propaganda. I've just been looking at the pages of Mumsnet for jihadists and the tweets that they have sent out today. One of them says, "I asked about the paths to paradise. It was said that there is no path shorter than jihad." I mean, this is pretty hot stuff in support of Anjem Choudhury. What are you all doing about those who are using Twitter in order to propagate terrorism this way? Because it's quite obvious. You don't need a BA in counterterrorism to understand that they are recruiting using Twitter.
Well, firstly, in terms of statistics, we have taken down tens of thousands of accounts. We, like Google, are thinking about how we can be more transparent.
Is that last year, or is that in the life of Twitter?
Those figures would be in the cumulative period of the last 12 months.
And are they broken down between counterterrorism and other areas, or are they global as they are in the case of other companies?
So that specific figure of tens of thousands of accounts is specifically relating to violent extremist accounts.
Tens of thousands?
Tens of thousands, yes.
You've taken down tens of thousands of Twitter pages?
Yes, and we're currently looking and considering how we can be more transparent, because we appreciate there is interest in this area. So we're having internal discussions about whether there's more we can do to provide extra data, and if we are able to do so, I'm happy to write to the committee subsequently with that data.
Will you be able to publish this information on
Yes.
a much more regular basis? Because it doesn't need a select committee of the House to get this information, does it?
No, and this is, and like other companies, we publish 6 monthly transparency reports. So one of the questions we're asking internally is, can we add this kind of data to our takedown reports we already publish?
But you all accept, each of you, a yes or no, that now this is the number one way in which people are being groomed on the internet for extremism. Mr. House, Dr. House?
So the question is the internet the number one way that people are being groomed? I'm afraid I don't know enough about how people are groomed offline to answer, but it's obviously something that we take very seriously.
Mr. Milner?
I'm not sure I do agree. I think, but also I think you'd be better off talking to people like the Quilliam Foundation, like the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, like the properly named International Centre for the Study of Radicalization. And I apologise to them for getting their name wrong earlier. They're the experts on how people are groomed. We are not. We're the experts on how we can keep this kind of content off Facebook. But what happens outside of Facebook, we can't see.
Mr. Pickles?
I'd agree. Professor Peter Newman has written a lot about this, and I'd recommend his writings to the committee.
Mr. Joe Ardner has a quick supplementary, then Nusrat Ghani.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. House, I just wanted to follow up on one point around, you said that you've removed 14 million videos, which is an extraordinary figure. And that shows that Google's current policy, if I understand it correctly, which is a team of reviewers working around the clock to look at the videos manually, is certainly working to an extent. But are you confident that this is actually succeeding in removing the dangerous material quickly enough in terms of preventing people from being radicalised in a short window, possibly, but short window could be time enough?
Yes, well, so it's certainly something that we think about, and we review how we do removals on a regular basis. It's worth noting that 400 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. And the vast majority of that is people using the product in the way it's intended, not to abuse anyone, not to radicalize. And so since YouTube was founded and as it has grown, we've had to think about what is the best way to do this. And continuing to this day, the best way is we have 1 billion people on the platform every month. And we found that the best way to get this stuff down quickly and to get it down reliably, it remains to have people flagging it and then removing it quickly, which does happen quickly. It happens in a number of hours.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ghani.
Thank you. Mr. Milner, you said that the initiatives that are taking place at the moment to deal with terrorism are because you feel it's recently come into the public domain, it's become a policy issue. Most of us would argue it's been an issue for a long time, and that your organisations are now just coming forward, either accepting some responsibility that people are being radicalised on your platforms, or you've got an issue with managing your brand, your company brands, because they seem to be hijacked by terrorist organisations who are grooming vulnerable people on your platforms. What would you say to that, Dr. House?
I think it's not I think this is not something that we've only just started thinking about. As I mentioned, we've had a zero tolerance policy on YouTube towards terrorist content since 2008 when we implemented the flag. We hosted our first summit on violent extremism in 2011. We've been working with the CTIRU at the Home Office since 2012. We hosted a counter-speech event with the Home Office and then with you fairly soon after that. So this is a multi-year
with the committee, not
with the committee in 2013, I believe. This is something we've been thinking about for many years, and obviously there's more work to be done.
If you have zero tolerance on YouTube, how come videos appear to enable people to groom younger, vulnerable people, or to export terrorism? How is your zero tolerance working?
So as I said, we have 400 hours of video uploaded every minute, and we therefore rely on the community to flag videos that violate our zero tolerance policy. For people who violate that policy after multiple violations or one serious violation, we will terminate the account and we prevent those groups. The person who created that account from creating a new account.
Who decide what is a serious violation?
So our community guidelines are fairly clear on the different types of infractions that happen. There are different ways that people will abuse a service like YouTube. But to be clear, we strictly prohibit calls for or glorification of violence. We specifically ban videos at training camps or direct recruitment. We specifically ban incitement of hatred against people based on their gender or race or nationality, and those are all serious violations of our policies.
Mr. Milner?
I can understand why something like the announcement that was made a couple of weeks ago that I talked about earlier can look as if the company has just discovered this. That's not the case. It's all about...
No, I said that the company was worried about its brand reputation, or it's accepting some responsibility.
We absolutely accept that we have a responsibility to act in partnership with civil society, with government, with expert academics. No, responsibility
that their platforms are being used to generate extremism.
We accept the responsibility that we have to be acting on this, absolutely. We are not responsible for the behaviour of people who abuse our platform, but we are responsible for ensuring we have the right policies in place, very well-trained people who can act on reports quickly and take action as required. But most importantly, we have a responsibility to help those organisations like Imams in Line, like the Active Change Foundation, like Connect Justice, who want to use our platform for good. So actually, so as well as the OCCI initiative, there are a number of other partnerships that we have in this country and elsewhere, where we're helping organisations who want to present an alternative view, typically of Islam, or it could be another religion or another belief, who want to use our platform for good. And that's something we've taken seriously for a long time. In fact, I appeared before this committee 3 years ago to talk about this very issue. We've learned a lot since then, and we're continuing to improve what we do and to invest more money into it.
Mr. Pickles?
Well, firstly, to echo policy points, our policies clearly prohibit encouraging terrorism, promoting terrorism. So one of the questions I think we have to ask as companies is sometimes what is on our platform is a reflection of society. And sometimes that's very uncomfortable because what you see is a very transparent view on what people are thinking. And I think where our responsibility is, and I know this is an area the committee might want to look into, is the role of companies is about making sure people can use our platforms to challenge ideas. Because we can remove all the content, but even if we remove the content, the idea remains. And a lot of this is about ideology and about ideas. And if we don't challenge the ideas, then the issues will not remain.
But you're not then generating conversation to challenge those ideas. I find it difficult to understand that Google, Twitter and Facebook take no responsibility whatsoever for people using their platforms to radicalise other people. If you had a shop and somebody walked in and started shouting at abuse at another customer or trying to recruit someone to be involved in a terrorist act, I hope that you as an individual would try and remove them from the shop, not expect someone else to come in to do that. But you are on your platforms. You're expecting other people to monitor and remove.
Mr. Milner?
Do you not take any responsibility?
Actually, if we use that example, that's exactly what we do. We remove them from the shop and we prevent them having a voice in our community. And also, if I just talk to you a little bit about what we've seen working with experts as can be the most effective voice, because one of the questions always put to us is, why don't you have a voice? Why doesn't Facebook step in and say, hey, that's not right? And actually, the work that we've done with Demos, looking at what kind of counter-speech works, shows us that actually it's not the platform, and frankly it's also not government or elected politicians whose voice matters in these debates. It's people who are more like those young people who might be radicalised. It's people who use humour. It's people who use very eye-catching content who are going to be more effective at drowning out those negative voices on our community.
Before I bring in Mr. Umuna and Victoria Atkins, can you just tell us how many people are in your hit squads? The places where this content is monitored and then reported or taken down. Mr. Pickles.
It's more than 100. It covers a lot of different teams, so a specific number is difficult.
100?
More than 100.
For how many accounts worldwide do you have? Just remind us.
There's 320 million people using Twitter. We have a variety of tools. Actually, to Simon's point, one of the issues we have is stopping people coming back on the platform.
Right.
So that actually resembles other technical challenges. So we can
use
100
to monitor 320 million?
It's more than 100. It varies depending on issues with language specialists.
Mr. Milner, Facebook, what is in the hit squad?
So we have a community operations team. We don't have a public number for that, but it does number in the thousands of employees who are part of our community operations team. The vast majority of whom, though, do not focus on counter-terrorism.
Sure.
We have an expert team that focuses specifically on the issue of terrorism, and then there's a wider team that focuses on. I'm afraid I can't give you a number.
Would you write
have a
to us and
public,
tell us?
I'm afraid not. I cannot. It's not a public number that we provide.
Right.
But I'd be very happy for you to come and meet some of them. You're very welcome to come to our Dublin office, where some of them work, and to come and meet that team and understand a bit more about their expertise and how they work.
Right. Thanks for the invitation. We'll let you know. Dr. House?
Much like Facebook, I'm not in a position to share a number. We don't have a public number of the size of our removals team, but it is a significant number.
But do you have such a squad?
We do, and it's around the world.
And is it also based in Dublin? Or?
We have some people based in Dublin, but we have people staffing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so it's a global team.
Right. I'm sorry, you didn't tell me the number of accounts you had worldwide.
So the latest number we have is 1.59 billion accounts, but remember we are not monitoring them.
No.
But we are handling reports.
Sure.
And we're handling millions of reports every day. Most of them are not about the issue that this committee is looking into.
Victoria Atkins and then Shuka Umuna.
Questions, first of all, to all three of you. You presumably all believe in corporate social responsibility. Yeah?
Yes.
Yes. And indeed, Google, your slogan until October last year was "Don't be evil." Is that right, Dr. Howe?
It still is, actually.
Oh, right. Okay. And you must accept, sitting here as you do, representing three of the largest companies on the internet, you accept that, sadly, the internet plays a vital role in extremism and terrorism, from the perspective of extremists and terrorists.
Certainly a serious problem, I would say.
Yes, I'm not sure I'd use the word vital. That implies that this wouldn't exist if the internet didn't exist. And it's impossible for us to know because the internet is so pervasive, but the problem of terrorism is clearly not something that started with the internet.
No, but all right, let's try and get a little closer together then. You'd accept that when we look at terrorism historically, now that the internet is here, it is easier for extremists and terrorists to speak to each other than it was 20, 30 years ago.
It's easier for everyone to communicate. Yep. That's the whole purpose of our services.
And just to keep an eye on it, given the questions I'm about to ask you, of course, this is also the case for paedophilia, sadly. The internet plays a role in that.
And our companies have been at the absolute forefront of helping to combat the spread of such material and to bring people to justice.
And serious organised crime, because criminals use the internet just as everybody else does.
Yes.
So why did none of your companies choose to attend the joint committee that is scrutinising the draft investigatory powers bill in the House of Lords at the moment?
Well, I think firstly, one thing to say is there was a joint statement made, which was a comprehensive statement of issues with the bill. Secondly, I understand the committee wanted us to attend together, and the committee was working on a very accelerated timescale, and so there wasn't a refusal. It was the fact that trying to get companies from people across the world in the same room at the same time at just a few weeks' notice. My understanding is actually it was difficult to get everybody in the room, and I think our submission actually will evidence the fact of how seriously and how comprehensively we have looked at these bills, and indeed how the seriousness with which we take this bill was the fact that 5 global tech companies, the 3 of ourselves and Microsoft and Yahoo, came together to make a unified statement about our concerns with the bill demonstrates just how seriously we are taking it.
May I deal with the time factor, because I should declare I'm on the committee. This meeting today was organised at very short notice, wasn't it? Last week? Perhaps 2 weeks ago?
Yes.
Yes. And we've managed to get all three of you in the room. The joint committee, made significant efforts to fit in with your company's timetables so that we could hear your evidence, and yet you still declined. Why were you afraid to come before the joint committee to be asked about your views on what is one of the most important pieces of legislation this Parliament will deal with?
Well, firstly, I think there's been a discussion with the committee for some time over diary dates. I know I made several comments about when I was free over a prolonged period of time. I think, secondly, our joint submission is very, very clear. We're not afraid of engaging on this issue. Our joint statement, and I gave evidence to the previous joint committee on the communications data bill in a previous role, and I think the substance of the submission you saw from industry on this bill more than surpasses the kind of discussion that happened last time. So I don't accept the premise of the question. I think we've taken it very seriously.
I have nothing to add to the logistics points that Mr. Pickles has made, but I would say that I reject any suggestion that this implies that our companies don't care about the issue, don't care about the investigatory powers bill and the important powers they will convey on the authorities and the issues that we particularly address in our submission, nor does it mean that we don't take our responsibility seriously in respect of the issues before this committee.
Dr. House?
The logistical challenges are a bit outside my direct area of expertise. I cover all of Europe, Middle East and Africa. But I would simply repeat that we are committed to working with the British government and making sure the investigatory...
Thank you.
I should add, we heard evidence from a judge in New Zealand, 5 o'clock our time, 5 a.m. his time. So we did do Skype, if that was available to any of your employees internationally, but we'll leave it there. Mr. Pickles, I want to deal with your phrase about when Twitter chooses to tip off people that law enforcement have made inquiries about with you. And I think I picked up the phrase that you said that it may be more reasonable, you tell users where it may be reasonable to tell them that they are the subject of law enforcement. Have I heard you correctly?
It's context specific, yes.
What is the interpretation of reasonableness according to Twitter?
Well, it would be the same term of reasonableness that a US court would use, or indeed any court. I think it's a useful opportunity for me to clarify, and I apologise to the committee if I wasn't clear. In the case of an ongoing counterterrorism investigation, that would be a circumstance where we would not seek to provide user notification that a request for data had been made.
Let's be clear, you said you did tip them off, you're now saying you didn't.
No, so I'm not aware of specific cases, but in the case of a hypothetical case of a counter-terrorist request for user data, that is a case that would fall within the exception, which is clear in our policy as a counterproductive circumstance.
Does paedophilia fall within that definition?
I think that's another example of where we would not seek to provide user notice because of an ongoing investigation.
Does serious organised crime fit within that definition?
Again, I imagine that's a circumstance where we would not provide user notice.
Who makes the decision on reasonableness for Twitter?
Well, we have a legal team working on these issues, and as I say, it's worth pointing out, in terms of the number of requests, in a year, we see hundreds, for a platform of 320 million people globally, more than 15 million in the UK. In the first half of 2015, we had 299 requests. So I think to put this into context, there's a huge amount of information available publicly on Twitter that doesn't need to come to us. And we also work with the police. Tomorrow morning, I'm joining a conference call to help the police understand our policies in this area.
I just want to get to the bottom of this, because as you'll understand, with one of the balancing acts that the Joint Committee is having to grapple with is the balance of civil liberties against national security and keeping our country safe from terrorism and also serious organised crime. I just want to get a sense of who decides in your legal team that a request is unreasonable, a request made by law enforcement, that's unreasonable. What right of appeal do police officers have against that?
Mr. Pickles?
Well, this is why we have, as I say, tomorrow morning we're having a conversation with UK law enforcement to discuss these issues, to help them understand our policies. It's also one of the reasons why in our submission, in the US, to give you an example, in other jurisdictions, there is a time period for police once they've requested data to investigate. At the end of that time period, the police can either allow user notification to happen or go before a judge and ask for an extension. And one of the questions that we've asked of the Investigatory Powers Bill is such a framework would make the situation clearer for everybody, is where a judge makes a decision of should someone be
Mr.
notified
Milner?
or not.
Anything to add? You don't have to add, just nod if you don't have it. Dr. House? No?
I don't have anything to add. Is there something else that you want to know from me specifically?
Mr. Pickles, I find it very interesting that a tech company should be telling Parliament how best to police law enforcement and security service inquiries. I suspect that may be one of the reasons why your company decided it was best not to come before the committee.
I apologise if that was the impression I gave. I did not mean to give that
Thanks
impression.
very much.
The final question is, the Investigatory Powers Bill focuses on the double lock, that is the mechanism by which the Secretary of State, be it the Home Secretary, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland or whoever, judges a warrant to be necessary and proportionate, and that is then approved by a judicial commissioner. My question to you, Mr. Pickles, is why Twitter thinks that your legal team supersedes the Home Secretary and the Judicial Commissioner in its definition of reasonableness.
And I think if you look at the submission our companies have made on this particular point, one of the questions we have is, what happens when a request that has gone through that process may be either technically not possible, or actually maybe a request for information which would not be in compliance with US law. So there is a conflict of law question in this area of policy, which is why all our companies have encouraged the British government and the United States government to work closely on building a legal framework, because actually we don't want to have to make those decisions. We would like a court to make those decisions.
Mr. Pickles, you're not answering my question. I asked you what gives your legal team in Twitter the right to override the Secretary of State and the Judicial Commissioner.
As I say, we're not overriding anybody. What we're doing is respecting that there are different legal frameworks at play.
I'm not interested in the legal frameworks elsewhere. I'm talking about a warrant being issued in the United Kingdom to stop a terrorist attack. What gives Twitter the right to override the Home Secretary and the Judicial Commissioner? In the case of an emergency threat to life, we would provide information and have consistently done so, as none of the witnesses have raised otherwise. But this is one of the very reasons why an international legal framework is so important.
Yes, I think you made that clear. Thank you. We just have to move on. Before I bring in Mr. Winnick, Mr. Amuna had a supplementary on the original set of questions, I think.
Yes, actually, I just first of all wanted to follow up on a question that you asked, Chair.
Yes.
And Mr. Pickles provided an answer, but Mr. Milner and Dr. House didn't, which was in relation to the number of people working in the teams removing content. Now, Mr. Pickles has provided us with a rough figure against a user group of 320 million, I think you said. What I don't understand is why Dr. House and Mr. Milner won't provide those details to the committee. You didn't just say, both of you didn't just say that you can't, you said that your companies won't provide those figures publicly.
Mr. Milner?
Why?
I'm happy to take that away, Mr. Amuna, and write to the committee in regard to it. I will check again with my colleagues, but my understanding is we've been asked this question before. I was asked it 3 years ago. It's not information that we make public, but I will ask again.
Dr. House?
We're in a similar situation.
And you'll write to us?
We will write to you.
On that. Okay.
Mr. Milner?
My 2 points. One was for Twitter and the other was for all of you. I just want to check one thing that has been reported and was reported in April of last year, Mr. Pickles, and this was in the Daily Mail, which is why I want to check whether or not it's factually correct. Is it true that more than 10,000 accounts linked to Daesh militants and their supporters were suspended in a 24-hour period in a fresh crackdown on those tweeting violent threats? Is that correct?
To date, we have definitely suspended more than tens of thousands of accounts. As to that specific time period, I'm not sure, but cumulatively, we have certainly suspended more than that figure of accounts.
Would you be able to write to the committee and let us know whether that is an accurate report or not? And if it is, explain why, if it is the case that this was done in a 24-hour period, 10,000 or more were done in that 24-hour period and they weren't suspended beforehand. Do you think you could write and explain to us?
Thank you.
Why?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, my question is, the questions that the Chair and others have posed to you have been based around when you receive a request for information from a law enforcement agency, I want to ask you a question about the threshold that applies in each of your companies before you proactively notify law enforcement of there being terrorist material that has been identified by your company or by users. What is the threshold beyond which you decide in each of your companies that you must proactively notify the law enforcement agencies?
Dr. House?
Threat to life.
Mr. Milner?
Exactly the same for us.
We don't proactively notify, and actually one of the things, because Twitter's public, that content's available, so often it's been seen already, and then law enforcement have established criteria to come to us and request information.
So just so I've got that right, Twitter has no proactive approach to notifying law enforcement of potential terrorist material on Twitter?
No, and actually one of the things that's very important to flag here is this was discussed in Congress recently. There was discussions about putting this into a legal requirement, and the FBI director was asked, would he support such a proposal, and he did not support that proposal. One of the reasons is because, as I say, if we're taking down tens of thousands of accounts, that's a huge amount of information, and we're not in a position to judge credibility of those threats. So actually, you may end up in a situation where you swamp law enforcement with unwanted information. So I think that's why the FBI director said.
Notwithstanding whatever the FBI felt was appropriate for the United States, with regard to the United Kingdom, do you think it is right that you are the ones who should determine the threshold that should apply in those circumstances? Or do you believe that actually the better approach would be for there to be a legal framework that others, perhaps judicially can apply to determine when you should proactively provide information on potential terrorist activity on your platforms?
A legal framework is always preferable. The one problem we have in this area is different countries around the world, we all operate internationally, have a different definition sometimes of what is a terrorist. And so that a legal framework is preferable, but it's important to bear in mind the international precedent you would set in that space.
Yes, thank you. You have said that before. Thank you. David Winnick.
There are two separate issues. I'll come to the question of the powers the Home Secretary wants, which was raised by my colleague, Miss Atkins. But first of all, do you accept there's dissatisfaction generally, not only in Parliament, certainly in Parliament, but amongst the public, over the way in which those who wish to engage in terror use social media and continue to do so? I mean, it's a yes or no response, really. I mean, do you accept this feeling of dissatisfaction?
Speaking for Google, absolutely. We would prefer if no one abused our platform to abuse individuals or to promote terrorism.
So one assumes you do.
I think in general the fact that there is enormous public disquiet about extremism and terrorism and radicalization, then of course people are rightly to be concerned about wherever it appears, including online.
You see, if you take, for example, one of the two murderers of the soldier which took place, Lee Rigby, he put his aims on Facebook, saying what he intended to do. I understand that Facebook had not been aware of what occurred. However, the Intelligence and Security Committee here then discovered that Facebook had previously shut down this person's account, obviously very rightly so, but failed to relay such concerns to the security service. Would that be right, Mr. Milner?
Mr. Winnick, the committee of which you speak in their report did not name any company. I'm unable to talk about individual cases, as I hope you'd understand, but I can reassure you that when our company comes across information which there is an immediate threat to life, we provide that to the authorities. And any requests associated with terrorists or would-be terrorists we take extremely seriously. We have an expert team that deal with those cases.
You see, the person that was sentenced yesterday, the female who had gone with a young child to Syria, then returned, during the course of the proceedings in court, and also in the judge's summing up, when the person had been found guilty by the jury, it appeared that she had used social media to advertise her intentions. I mean, the whole point, I mean, the reason that you're here to a large extent is what I started at the beginning of my questioning, the concern that what couldn't possibly happen in any way with ordinary print material happens on social media because of the very nature of the companies in which you are senior executives.
I would draw a very strong distinction between, say, the pages of the Daily Mail online or Times Online and Facebook. Facebook is a community of almost 1.6 billion people. There are billions of things being posted every single day, most of that extremely benign, indeed uplifting, from right across the world. However, just like the UK, which has a population of 60-odd million, there are some bad people. And there are some people who want to use our service with ill intent, including the most serious crime of terrorism.
To say the least. To say the least.
To say the least, absolutely. And we absolutely want to root them out and do everything we can to stop them doing that, Mr. Winnick. And believe me, we are committing more resources to this month by month and learning as we go and working very closely with the authorities. We'd much prefer that wasn't the case, much as we'd prefer that there weren't people trying to radicalise young people in communities right across the UK. We'd love to be able to press a button to get rid of them, but you can't. It's not as easy as that. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of resource, a lot of intelligence. And believe me, we are applying our best endeavours to this, and we will continue to do so. And we expect to be held to account, as per this committee, for what we're doing. But we're very serious about it.
Mr. Pickles, do you want to answer Mr. Winnick's question?
I think one of the points, just to follow on, is yes, social media brings out things that are discomfort, and it highlights issues in society. There was some research from Northern Ireland, which was funded by the Northern Ireland Community Relations Council, that actually said, while the challenge is there is also an opportunity. And the opportunity for using social media to engage across cultural boundaries, across social boundaries, where they didn't exist previously, is how people will meet people from different faiths. And Megan Phelps-Roper, who was the person who formerly ran the social media for the Westboro Baptist Church, actually talked very movingly, and she's coming into our office in a few weeks, about how engaging with someone over social media was how she rehumanised in her mind this other person that she'd been told she should hate. And that process actually led to her leaving the Westboro Baptist Church. So I think this actually is also an opportunity to challenge ideas.
Now, while there is unanimous opinion in Parliament, to say the least, that every effort should be made to avoid social media being used by those who want to carry out terrorism, atrocities like we saw in Paris and indeed in London in 7/7. There's not the same unanimous view about what the Home Secretary is intending to seek. And therefore, when Ms Adkins put up a view to you, it should be said that Parliament hasn't reached a decision on this at the moment. Do you recognise there is, however, a much divided opinion amongst the public and certainly in Parliament over what the Home Secretary is intending to ask Parliament to approve?
Dr. House?
Absolutely, we acknowledge that, and that it is not a settled decision in the UK. I think one of the important contextual things to note is that the UK government is taking a leading role in modernising surveillance laws for the 21st century. Like most other countries, the surveillance laws here haven't been updated since most people had access to the internet as they were walking around, and so it's right that that the modernization of those laws be looked at.
Mr. Milner?
Dr. House puts it very well. I couldn't put it better. I would say that I am responsibility for Facebook in a number of countries, including the Middle East, Israel, Turkey. I really hope that the UK gets this right, because I think if it does, it could set an important benchmark for many other countries that I operate in. And I'm always asked about, well, what is happening in the UK? And people are looking to this part. So it's not just about the safety of 60 million people in the UK. It actually could have ramifications right across the world, frankly.
Sure. Mr. Pickles?
I think that's absolutely right. The international precedent this bill will set is worth bearing in mind when considering it. I think we've been grateful as an industry for dialogue with the Home Office about the substance of it, and we do look forward to hearing the committee's work to take forward this important bill.
Mr. Winnick?
There are cynical people in this world. The chair in the beginning said we're not involved in matters concerning tax, or at least we're not concerned when we're sitting around here. Some of us are very, very concerned about your tax position when we're in the chamber itself, but we're not involved with it this afternoon in the Home Affairs Committee.
Indeed.
However, as I've said, there are cynical people, and I've seen a report in the newspaper which says in effect that because of the controversy over tax affairs and the fact you're very much on the defensive, and some would say so are ministers, it's going to be said that you will come to some sweetheart deal over what the Home Secretary is intending, what many of us would describe as a snooper's bill, in order to minimise the embarrassment your three companies are facing over tax. Indeed, the chair of this committee, if I may be so bold as to quote you, said that you would be very wise to work very closely with the government on the powers she wants. Now, he was speaking, as he has every right to speak, as a member of Parliament, not on behalf of his committee. We haven't reached a decision. But what do you say to that cynical view that because of the embarrassment which you're suffering as companies over tax matters, you'll make some sort of deal with the government, despite what you've said just a moment ago?
Very quickly, we don't want to concentrate tax, but do you regard the Home Secretary as your sweetheart, Dr. House?
Certainly not. I would simply say each of these policy matters is serious and worth serious consideration, and at least in my mind and in the mind of the team I work with at Google, there isn't bleed over. We need to have all of these conversations.
Thank you. Mr. Milner?
I think one is a matter of policy, and that's legislation which is not yet set, and one is a matter about the application of policy which has been established, of legislation. Completely different teams deal with it in our company, and there is no discussion between them about the matters you described.
I think if you read our submission to the Joint Committee, it's very clear that we have ambitions the bill can be made better.
No sweetheart deals then on this issue?
No. I think we have the answer. Just on the issue of instant messaging apps, is one of the concerns that you all had, together with Yahoo and Microsoft, that the legislation that is currently written could ban the use of these instant messaging services because of their end-to-end encryption. Is that one of the concerns that has been raised?
There's certainly an issue around clarity as to what the provisions of the draft bill entail in respect of the issue of encryption. But I wouldn't suggest that we're concerned that certain services will therefore be banned. But as with all matters of legislation, you know this much better than we do, having certainty about what this actually means is extremely important.
Thank you. Mr. Joe Wardner.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. House, I wonder if I could first ask you one question before broadening out to your colleagues. We've heard a lot in the press about the so-called Islamic State's effective use of social media, yet Jared Cohen of Google has deemed them, quote, not a tech-savvy organisation. How much of their success, if we can put it like that, do you attribute to their use of social media?
I'm afraid the success or otherwise of Islamic State outside the use of our platforms is beyond my level of expertise. I would say that we are extremely effective at removing both videos and accounts that are created by foreign terrorist groups, and that we are extremely effective at removing re-uploads of those videos after they've been removed.
But so to take those videos, YouTube being a form of social media,
yes.
Do you believe that some of the success that these terrorists have had is based on their use of your platform, and how much would you say that your platform has been used to lever new supporters into this satanic state?
It's a constant cat and mouse game, as with any form of abuse of our services, but it's one that we are well equipped to meet.
And so are you working with the government or any community or youth-based organisations to provide an online alternative narrative?
Absolutely, and that's something that we haven't really talked about yet today. I think we've mentioned several times that there's a zero tolerance policy. We should get the bad stuff down, but it's also extremely important that people are able to find good information, that when people are feeling isolated, they go online and they find a community of hope, not a community of harm. And so we have worked as I mentioned before, with the Home Office, with this committee, and that has actually been a model for our work on counter-narratives around the world.
So do you have any examples of some of the work you've done?
Yeah, I think one of the primary examples would be Abdullah X, which was a video series that we launched together with the European Union in 2013, which is a formerly radicalized man who appears in cartoon form, uses humor and the types of language that the people at risk of being radicalized connect with to draw them away from ideologies of terror.
And how many people did that reach?
I don't have the number to hand, but I can write to you and provide it. I think it is worth saying, and I've said this a couple times before, that this isn't done, right? We're constantly looking at new ways to make sure that this is more effective. This year, one of the things that we're looking at is we're running 2 pilot programs. One is to make sure that these types of videos are more discoverable on YouTube. The other one is to make sure that when people put potentially damaging search terms into our search engine, they also find this counter-narrative work.
Thank you. Mr. Milner.
Yes, we work with a number of organisations. I mentioned Imams Online earlier, and in my home city of Bradford recently, we took part in a training programme. I think Mr. Pickles was at as well, in the fine Cedar Court Hotel. But I'd also want to emphasise this is not just about radicalisation of young Muslims. We also are concerned about extremist speech which is directed at Muslims. So we've done some work with Tel Mama, which is the major UK hotline for Islamophobic hate crime, to help ensure that they make the best use of our platform to let people know that they exist. And also with the Community Security Trust, who are focused on anti-Semitic hate crime. So a lot of focus is on radicalisation and the young Muslim community, and absolutely we're looking to see what we can do there. But as our OCCI initiative I announced earlier is right across the spectrum, and we want to have partnerships across the piece.
Mr. Pickles?
No, and I think just to follow on from that, I was in Belfast a few weeks ago with the Centre for Democracy and Peace Building, and I think one of the challenges is that not just to focus on one type of extremism, to actually look at the broader social issues. And what we did there was actually try and help community organisations, and actually the Police Service of Northern Ireland, to themselves come up with the most pressing issues. And I think the important thing is, while our companies can help with expertise, is we're not the messengers, and the people who are the most credible messengers are these community groups.
So what more do you think we could all together be doing to create a more credible, positive message, working with communities, using the tools at the disposal of the state, and indeed working with businesses who manage these platforms to actually provide alternatives to young people and make sure that their perhaps misguided views are addressed with as swiftly as possible? Anyone?
Mr. Pickles?
Well, I think, just looking at some quotes, Melanie Smith from the Institute of Strategic Dialogue raised the question of, can we use women who've returned from Syria as messengers to talk about what's happened there? I think that's a good question. Also, the role of government communicating international aid work to communities. I think there's different messengers for different communities. Our hope is that we can have more of them in every environment, and that's why we work with an Adaptive Change Foundation in Walthamstow, right across to Belfast, to Bradford, to Scotland. It's a full spectrum approach.
I'd say that one of the things government needs to recognise is that, and perhaps you, when you're interrogating ministers, is not always to beat them on ministers for why aren't they doing more, but actually, in terms of the voice of government, actually the voice of government doesn't work. It just doesn't work when it comes to counter-speech. So kind of actually using research about what does work. So talk with Demos, talk with ISD, talk with Peter Newman and his team, and then use that, and I'm sure you always want to be evidence-based in your question, but use that to interrogate things like the prevent strategy, rather than just assuming that more money equals more effective.
Dr. House?
I don't have anything but my colleagues have said.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
I don't have anything beyond what my colleagues have already said.
And if I could just make one final request, Mr. Milner, Mr. Pickles, Dr. House said that he'd provide us with some further information on the number of people reached and therefore helped, we hope, by the resources that Google has deployed. I'd be grateful if you would do the same with some of the examples you've talked about.
We can follow up and write to you.
Thank you.
Before I come to your fellow Bradford citizen, Naz Shah, on the issue of diversity in your organisation, one of the key features of trying to deal with the Daesh narrative is to have Arabic speakers and those from the community. What kind of numbers do you have, Mr. Pickles, in terms of, in your group of 100, how many would be either Arab speakers or those who actually know and understand the community? Because obviously you and I may not do so.
No, and to reiterate, it's more than 100. It's not an absolute figure. And there's expertise from across the company. We absolutely have local language specialists looking at this
I'm
material.
talking about the 100. How many would be Arabic speakers?
I don't have that number to hand. I can investigate if it's possible. But across the company, we have a whole range of language support operating in multiple time zones, so they can address Indonesia as well.
You'd be very welcome to come and meet them. Some of them are based in our Dublin office, the Arabic-speaking team from a number of countries across the Middle East and North Africa. We don't publish a number of how many they are, but believe me, this is an area of strong investment.
Dr. House?
So we've said publicly that we're actively recruiting Arabic speakers to increase the effectiveness of this team. And this is the same as when we see other new threats. When we see revenge porn, for example, we hire experts in that who understand the types of harm, but also understand what types of solutions are appropriate.
Thank you. Nasha?
Thank you, Chair. Quick question about, you talked about removing videos. You can remove them and you make sure they don't come back up. Are you tracing right back to the IP addresses, or is it just the accounts?
So I'd rather not go into the technical specificities so that people can't figure out how to outwit our systems. But abuse of our systems is something that we've been familiar with since our inception as a company, and getting people who are trying to commit, for example, basic financial fraud and preventing them from creating new accounts or being able to engage with our systems again. So it's similar lessons to the other technical challenges of abuse of our systems.
And do any of you actually, whilst I appreciate you've got a flag system, do actually any of you be specific in talking about terrorism? So for example on Twitter, I know that I had lots of Twitter trolling or accounts set up when I was going through the election, and the amount of time it took me to get even one account removed was absolutely appalling. So it took me days, if not weeks, to have them removed, because the process that you have to go through is just you're jumping through hoops and having to go back to screen. So you can't. It's not just a sequential order that you can just report something. So have you improved that in the last year, in particular Twitter? And how long on average does it take you to remove an account?
No, we've absolutely. This is an area where we're always trying to strike a balance between making things simple for users and then not increasing the number of reports in our system so that it slows down our response. So we've absolutely invested in how we can make that quicker. I'm sorry to hear of that experience. We don't have an average takedown, because what we say is that we try and focus on the most pressing cases. So we will focus on violent threats and direct threats of violence before we will focus on offensive content, for example.
Okay,
so we try to get through everything as fast as we can.
So coming back to terrorism, then do you have something which is specific about this is terrorist material, so you prioritise it? Because to me, that would be higher up my agenda in terms of priority. So how do you prioritise it?
So for law enforcement, for example, and NGOs, we have a specific form to report that kind of content through. For users, we don't. And this is, again, one of the areas we keep under review and making sure that we're striking a balance. But one of the challenges that we all have is whenever we provide users with controls, often they're used for people to try and get content taken down they disagree with. And that's a challenge because it increases the number of reports that are inaccurate in our areas.
No, sure.
So the Jihadi Net Mums Act, the chair
Mum's Net for jihadists.
These kind of accounts, you're going to, if they're just user accounts, you can't remove them.
No, we absolutely. If they break our terms of service, we will absolutely remove them, and we will aim to remove them as quickly as possible.
So, have you looked at that organisation?
It's not what I'm familiar with, but I will do with following this appearance.
Okay, but it's that kind of information you expect the public to give you, rather than your 100 people beavering away in Dublin or wherever they are.
And the benefits of being a public platform and having large user bases is users do report those accounts.
But the point Naz Shah is making, which is been echoed by other people, is it takes too long for Twitter to act. She's not saying that you don't act, it just takes too long for them to act. What are you doing about speeding that process up?
Well, and actually the reason why the figure 100 became public domain was because we tripled the size of the team working on things. So we have already invested in the people, we continue to do so, we continue to invest in technology to actually help us find things. And to follow Dr. House, one of our challenges was how do you stop people recreating accounts when you suspend them? So we started asking people for a mobile phone number, so to stop accounts with the same phone number coming back. So we can use technology from other areas like spam to actually stop these accounts coming back, but it's an area we will continue to invest in.
I have Stuart. Very quick, yes.
Just in terms of what you were talking about, particularly Simon, you were talking about working with Child Mama and other organisations. Yeah. What I feel is coming across here is very much like a denial of responsibility and passing it back. which I really struggle with. And aside from working with people that are already there, what are you doing as initiatives that you, as social media your corporate social responsibility that my colleague earlier touched on, what are you doing in trying to invest in this area? Because it would seem, I'm not comfortable with what I've heard today.
Michelle, I'm sorry you feel like that, and I'd be very happy to follow up with you afterwards if you think there are some things that we could perhaps help with in your constituency. But just to be clear, we take this issue incredibly seriously to what's happening on our platform. So we're investing in it, we're making sure our reporting is effective, we're making sure we have the right kind of relationships, for instance, with the CTIRU in the Home Office, who can also flag cases to us very quickly. But in terms of because we recognise from the research that others have done that people don't typically just get radicalised online, it's a combination of in-person and online contact, that actually working with community-based organisations like Imams Online,
yes,
who can understand the context of what's happening with young people in their communities, so they can address the online bit or the Facebook bit of what's happening in their community. It's something that we can help them with.
Thank you. I think, Mr. Shaw, before you came in, the company set out their strategy, but we will write to them again. I think Ms. Shah has raised some very important points. Perhaps you could write to us again, specifically on the points that she has raised. I think that would be very helpful. We're running out of time, colleagues. Stuart MacDonald first.
Yep, I'll be as quick as I can. Dr. House, could you just say very briefly what the Trusted Flagger programme is that applies to YouTube?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the challenges we have is, despite having 1 billion users, they might not understand how to flag effectively. And the example that always comes to my mind is that our most flagged video ever is a Justin Bieber video, simply because people dislike it. And so we are confronted with how do we increase the number of high-quality flags that we have. And so we work with both government agencies, including the CTIRU at the Home Office and Europol, but also NGOs, to help them understand what our community guidelines are and give them additional tools for flagging. And what we found is that whereas the general public has about a 1/3 accuracy rate for flagging, these trusted flaggers tend to have around a 90% accuracy rate. So it's much easier for us to prioritize their flags and to act quickly on them.
But is there a way in which you could add some members of the public to that? For example, if there are members of the public who have made 4 or 5 flags and they all turn out to be well-founded, that they then are given
we'd
priority?
absolutely consider that.
Yeah, sure. Because one of the things I picked up speaking to the young folk in Bradford last week was a frustration that they make flags and yet nothing happens. Is there a similar scheme for Facebook and Twitter?
We don't have a trusted flagger process in the same way. We do have arrangements with CTIU and similar organisations in other governments to flag things to us. And we also have relationships with safety organisations who can let us know when they think our normal reporting processes have not worked, as in that they think we've come to the wrong judgment about a particular piece of content. But on the whole, we want people to use our standard reporting features, because when you report from Facebook, that report will get to the right person with the right language expertise, who's an expert in the issue that you're reporting. So it is by far the most effective way of letting us know about a piece of content. And because every report is looked at by an individual, then we can be sure that we are, the vast majority of situations, getting those judgments right. Not always, unfortunately. Of course, we'd love to be perfect, but we're not.
So we don't have a trusted flagger system, but what we do have is, similar to Facebook, we have a dedicated portal for groups like CTIRU to use, and we also work with safety expert organisations to bring things to our attention, and they can report directly to us as well. And then, as I say, we've invested in back-end, and this challenge, and the YouTube example is a pertinent one, this challenge of people reporting things they don't like and they disagree with, is something that has required a significant amount of investment to try and make some, the phrase is signal to noise ratio, is to try and bring out those good reports from the ones of people saying this is offensive, I don't like it. And that's where the real value of what's become counter-speech comes in, is that the response to something that you don't like is not to take it down, it's to challenge it. It's to challenge the idea that underpins that narrative. And that's where we'll actually tackle the underlying social issues that do lead to some of the issues we've heard about today.
Okay. And finally, just one last question. I was interested to read for Google's head of ideas, Jared Cohen. He was talking about forcing Daesh from the open web and hounding them from the traditional web. I mean, given the scale and the money and organisation that goes into peddling Daesh views and extremism, is that realistic? What does success look like here? Is it possible to drive them from the web, or how do we monitor success, or how do we know that you guys are getting it right?
This is not something where we would expect to be able to make our judgment. We rely on others. But if you read the reports from the Quilliam Foundation or Peter Newman's team at King's, they will tell you that Facebook has become a hostile place for Daesh. And that for us is good news. Doesn't mean that they don't try. Absolutely they will try. And so we want to share what we've learned about how we've made Facebook a hostile place with other platforms. But there are many more platforms, of course. Social media is not just the 3 companies sitting here. And they're being created all the time. So it's understandable that those people who want to use this kind of technology for evil will go to those places where they put less resource into it. They don't come and give evidence to select committees anywhere. It's hard to know who they are.
Thank you. James Berry.
Yes, Daesh are probably mounting the most successful publicity campaign for an evil regime since Goebbels and the Nazis in the 1930s, and they're using your platforms to do it. Against that effort by Daesh, your companies have some of the top tech brains in the world, and you are some of the most profitable companies in the world. I know that Google, or Alphabet at least, today became the most valuable company in the world. So are you seriously telling this committee that with all that expertise and with all the power your companies have, that you cannot do more in the fight against Daesh?
Dr. House.
I think it's always possible to do more. I've outlined some of the things that we're already looking at this year, but our discussions with the Home Office, our discussions with this committee are always good ways for us to understand what more can be done. I think, as I've outlined, we already are doing a lot, and this is something that is not new to us. We've been working on this topic for years. We and I'll repeat what Simon said earlier, we do want to be humble about what we are able to do. We can't solve all of the world's problems, but if we can make our platforms a hostile place for extremism, then we are committed to doing so, and we're committed to working with the other platforms who aren't here today to make sure that they have the same skills.
I reject what you suggest.
Mr. Milner.
I reject what you're suggesting, that Daesh have been a success because of our platform. Absolutely, that's not the case. We are one of the main, we've worked very hard to disrupt what they do in partnership with other organisations also committed to disrupting them. And we will continue to strive to do better. Of course, we can always do more, and we're always trying to learn, but I reject the suggestion that we don't care about the issue. That's far from the truth.
That wasn't the suggestion. The question was, because I'm sure you could do more, but you may have reasons of principle or cost for not doing more. But there is plainly technologically more you do. I mean, Facebook, you ban nipples, and it causes offence to women with breast cancer or to women who are breastfeeding, that you have technology that bans pictures of nipples, and yet terrorist content from ISIS sometimes seems to get through the net. So
Mr. Berry, with respect, that's not true. We do allow pictures of breastfeeding, and we allow people to post pictures of mastectomy scars. We don't allow nudity, but we do not use technology to find nudity. We rely on human review of reports. There's no technology that spots nipples, female nipples.
Mr. Bickles.
Yes, I mean,
what do you say to Mr. Berry?
It's a useful point, and I'd absolutely echo. Numerous academics have looked at this question of automating an algorithm to find this content, and particularly dealing with text and language. I think that's something which is a distant hope for the future, but is incredibly difficult to do now. And actually, speaking of doing more, I think, as we've heard, we all look to do more. J.M. Berger, who's with the George Washington University Programme on Extremism, again, these are the people to validate our efforts, and I think he published a report last March that said that the IS supporting social network on Twitter has been significantly constrained by the suspension campaign. I think that it is possible to measure success, but we're not the people to be the auditors, if you like. It's for academics to talk about this. And finally, social media is one part of the ecosystem. There's still face-to-face interaction. There's still the question of territory. And actually, the Daesh controlling territory is, as recognised by academics, an important part of its propaganda.
All three of your companies invest a huge amount of money in making yourselves more profitable, in generating more advertising revenue. You've been very successful. You're all very popular in the services you provide. Can you give this committee an idea of how high up your list of priorities combating ISIS's use of your platforms is?
obviously you've covered this in the earlier evidence that you gave, but just a word is fine.
I would just say it's of fundamental importance. We don't want our platform to be an unsafe place, and our ongoing success is critical.
Mr. Milner?
Keeping people safe on Facebook is our number one priority. ISIS is part of that, but it's absolutely not the only extremist organisation or behaviour that we care about.
Mr. Pickles?
Absolutely, this is taken seriously across the top ranks of the company.
Mr. Umuna, and finally Mr. Akani.
The issue is, just to pick up with what James just asked you, is that Mr. Berry just asked you, is that ultimately, if you were to dedicate more resource to taking action and doing more, as Mr. Berry has just described, you would probably need to take Twitter's example, more than 100 people onto your team to keep a check on what is happening in relation to 320 million users. And part of your challenge, would you not accept, is that whilst I don't know the extent to which you sit on your parent and subsidiary company boards, is that your directors, your strategic management, have a legal obligation to maximise profitability, but you also have obligations in respect of public safety.
Mr.
And
Milner?
would you accept you don't always get that right?
Mr. Milner, a quick answer.
We started at the earlier proceedings by comments about Ms. Sandberg and her speech in Berlin recently. That demonstrates the commitment from the absolute top of our organisation to doing everything we can to continue to make Facebook a hostile place for extremists and anybody wanting to organise terrorism. There's absolute commitment to this. We don't shirk from it or absolutely want to be held to account from it. We want to do more. We want to do more in an informed way based on the evidence of what works.
And the appointment of Monica Burkhardt, a former prosecutor, to set up your counter-terrorism squad, the numbers of which you won't tell us how many work in it, with offices all over the world.
Monica's been part of our company for a few years now, and she leads our content policy team across the world. She doesn't actually work in the community operations team, where the experts in terrorism are, but she works very closely with them, as I do, and my policy colleagues from across the world when required. So there's an awful lot of cross-functional working, and Monica is absolutely the heart of that.
But the announcement she made last Thursday, was that something?
That was an interview with Yahoo News in which she talked about the work that we are doing in this space. I'm not aware there was a particular announcement, but she did set out perhaps more detail than had been shared previously about what we do.
Mr. Munna has a quick...
My final question actually to Mr. Pickles. I mean, I've raised the conflict that inevitably there's going to be between the bottom line and keeping people safe, but I feel duty bound to ask Mr. Pickles how he can come at these issues objectively. This is a question, not necessarily a statement of my view, but I think we have to ask you. You were part of a civil liberties and privacy campaign group, Big Brother Watch. What confidence can people have, in light of your background and your campaigning activity, which I have nothing against necessarily, that you can approach these issues in an even-handed and objective manner?
Well, I think, I have one background. We also employ people who used to work for the FBI. We have a range of backgrounds in the company. It's one of the great things about having a company that shares diverse opinions, is these challenging issues. But let me assure you, when we see campaigns like Black Lives Matter or You Ain't No Muslim Bruv on our platform, they are the campaigns that give us the greatest sense of pride, because they're challenging the issues of the day.
Thank you. And Ms. Raheel, a very quick final question.
Just following on what Mr. Umana and Mr. Berry said about making a profit. You've talked about all the people that you rely on, all the different campaigns you work with. Surely the quickest way is reducing the threshold with what levels of abuse people can post on your website. It's looking at your community guidelines. But of course that means having more than 100 people monitoring, or whatever numbers that you have. It means collecting data, and that's going to eat into your profits. And I'm worried that you're going to come back and talk about freedom of expression. But surely when you're talking about safety in community, that trumps that to some degree. And I follow my colleagues' concerns that this is more about making money than making sure your platforms are a safe space.
Can you give us a quick answer to that?
Our community guidelines go way beyond the law of the UK, or indeed any other country that I'm aware of, in terms of what we don't allow. So there is speech which is allowed not only in this place but on the streets of the UK that we don't allow in our community because we think it's not part of respectful dialogue.
Dr. House?
I would simply say I don't think those two things are in tension. The long-term profitability of our platforms is absolutely based on their being safe places.
Mr. Pickles?
Absolutely. Safety is something we see as a core part of our business, and we constantly refine our policies to make sure that we can keep people safe and give people greater clarity about, as Simon says, the content that we say is unacceptable.
Gentlemen, thank you for coming in. Do you feel hunted by Parliament over this issue? Or do you understand why, 3 years after we published a report on this committee, we are still concerned about the fact that the internet companies are not doing enough, as has been expressed by questions put by members of this committee, to deal with Daesh and to deal with those who try to propagate terrorism? Do you understand our real concern about this? Dr. House?
Absolutely. I think we're obviously doing a lot. There's more we could be doing, and the types of threats that we as a society face will continue to evolve. So it's an important conversation.
Mr. Milner?
I'm incredibly proud of the things my colleagues do in combating extremism and terrorism and the use of it on our platform. We all want to do more. I'd very much welcome the opportunity to introduce you to some of my colleagues who can't come here and indeed can't be public figures because of the work that they do. Believe me, this is an incredibly solid commitment. So if, as a result of this hearing, you still feel that our companies aren't committed to this cause, then we need to work harder to convince you.
Mr. Pickles?
This dialogue is extremely important to inform the policy debate. We have dialogue with government, with civil society.
It's not a dialogue today, to be frank. It's the committee asking you questions. We're not in a conversation. We will be producing a report which we hope will help you do your work. I was saying, do you feel hunted by Parliament, or do you understand why we're doing this?
No, absolutely. This is an issue of critical importance for everybody, parliamentarians, companies, and an opportunity to hear your concerns is invaluable.
And you mentioned several times the need for international cooperation. Do you think this is lacking? And very quickly, who should be taking the lead? Should it be the United States? Should it be the United Kingdom? Should it be the EU? Because there seems to be something happening in our jurisdiction and something completely different happening in other jurisdictions.
And we're seeing some really good examples of cooperation at EU level in terms of the Home Secretary and her colleagues meeting in that forum, and our global head of public policy, my boss's boss, came to that meeting to engage with that community. Recently, the UK government held a joint forum with Minister Gowrie from the United Arab Emirates and several representatives from that community. So
it's different forums, not one particular.
Different forums,
right.
Where, and it's all about sharing best practice.
And is that a problem,
Dr.
House, that it's different forums and not one particular organisation taking the lead? That's why people are not able to make sure that these particular laws are all working in the same direction?
I think every forum is a welcome forum. I think the UK government has shown a significant amount of leadership on this topic, but I think there's more that can be done on intergovernmental cooperation.
Mr. Pickles?
I actually spoke at the anti-Daesh coalition meeting, which was hosted in London by the FCO, which was an excellent example of bringing everybody together to focus on strategic communications. In the case of surveillance,
that's but that doesn't give us an international treaty. A meeting at the Foreign Office doesn't actually give us an international treaty, does it? Who should be taking the lead?
Well, as I said, I think a lead is being taken on surveillance. A legal framework is necessary. In other areas, it's cooperation and dialogue and sharing best practice. And I know I and colleagues around the world have been attending many meetings on this issue, and we will continue to do so.
Thank you so much for coming in. We're very grateful. And we'll be writing to you with some follow-up information that members of the committee have requested. Thank you so much. Thank you. Order, could we call Saleha Jaffer and Raheel Mohammed, please? Saleha Jaffer, Raheel Mohammed, my apologies for keeping you waiting. I'm afraid these things do overrun, but we're extremely grateful to you for coming here and for being part of this inquiry that we're holding into counterterrorism and the counter-narrative. I think Mr. Umuna has a declaration to make.
Just for the record, Chair, Ms Jaffer is a councillor in my constituency. and a constituent. She's a Labour councillor. I'm proud of her, but I feel the need to declare it for the record.
You're quite right to do so. Thank you
Yes.
very much. I want to start with both of you. This is as a result of the evidence we've received so far. What do you think, Mr. Mohammed, is the tipping point? What turns young British Muslims in particular, because if you look at the profile, that certainly seems to be the vast majority of those who go abroad, though there are others from outside the Muslim community who go abroad, from being, in the Prime Minister's words, law-abiding citizens, the recipient of everything that is good that this country has to offer. And I came here as a first-generation immigrant, so I know what this country has to offer. That turns them into people who suddenly want to leave their parents and go and fight abroad and give everything up. What's that tipping point? Help the committee find that tipping point.
So first of all, I'd like to say that I'm not an expert on radicalisation or on counter-terrorism. But we, as an organisation, have been doing lots of work with Muslim communities.
Yes.
And it's crossed-over criminal justice, health, education, gender inequality. So I guess if I can answer that question with a slightly longer answer.
Well, not too long.
Not too long.
But your opinion is fine. We're not looking necessarily for the world's greatest professor and PhD in this. What's your gut feeling on these issues?
I think there's probably not just a tipping point. I think, having listened to some of the sessions and just being involved in this work, I think one of the things that I find is that people are either seen as a health issue or an education issue or an extremism issue. And I think with the work that we've been doing, you can't disentangle all those different elements. So that's not a very helpful answer, but it's probably one that I think is more truthful. I think there's an ecosystem of different factors involved and different bodies and different influences, and it probably varies from case to case as well. And I think it's something that's in flux.
Saleh Jaffer, your organisation, FAST, does some very effective work with those who are suffering in this way, and I use the word suffering because it's the families who try to cope with what has happened.
Yes.
And we heard some evidence from the sister of someone who had gone abroad to fight for Daesh, Konica Da. I don't know whether you saw that evidence being given. Do you think there is a particular reason, a particular point that people cross and therefore nobody can stop them going because that tipping point has been reached? Or are we trying to find a template which just simply doesn't exist?
The template is not there yet, but we are working on it. We have some evidence by working in the community and especially with the families we work with that top of the list is, up till now, it is foreign policy. Young people are not happy with the foreign policy. The other one, second one, comes to our attention is that there is lack of communication. Communication has been broken down in families itself. So the older generation and younger generation are not able to communicate together so that they can get the values from their older generation. The third one is young people, adolescent minds, they want to show something, they want to be the heroes, they want other peer group to look up to them, and there is a power, there's a lot of power and heroism as well. So all these factors come into existence when somebody makes up their mind to go over to fight. When I speak to these people, they don't really understand Islam that much. They have no basic knowledge of Islam. They just listen from here and there, and they think that it's their duty. But when we probe into what is your duty as an Islam Muslim person, they don't have any clue. So it is impressions.
Yes, because one of the points that is always made and has been made in all the years that this committee has looked at this issue is the parents should be doing much more. Why are the parents not controlling their children? But the evidence that we've received and the conversations that certainly I've had is that the parents, in many cases, are the very last people to know.
No,
Is that what you found?
That is 100%. The cases I have done since 2007, too many referrals to us, and 90% of the parents, they had no clue. I mean, I'm working in Cardiff. I went to Bradford as well not long ago. We have cases all over the country. In Cardiff, I mean, this is public knowledge now, so I can say this. The medical student, first son of that family, he told his father that he's going to a medical seminar and went to Syria. 3 days later, he texted his mother to say, I'm in Syria. Please pray for me. I may not come back. So he's still there. So most of the times when we go and see these families, they say, what have we done wrong? They beat themselves so much, saying, what have we done wrong? Why did it happen to us? But they had no clue. There were no telling signs at all. It was all happening somewhere. And young people were preparing. And last minute, after they've gone, parents come to know about them.
Mr. Mohammed, do you get much support from the Home Office for the work that you're doing? You're obviously doing valuable work in respect of your community organisation. Is there any support that you get from any official body?
No, we've never looked for that support. Partly because I think, within the communities that I work with, having government support is seen as something that could be quite stigmatising and potentially leading to a lack of trust as well. I think we found it more efficient and quicker to actually work outside of the system, to get our stuff produced, whether it's a health resource or a project around raising aspirations for young Muslim women, and then to kind of diffuse that through the system. But I think if we started to work, if we, as a small organisation, getting caught up in the bureaucracy of large government departments, I think wouldn't enable us to do our work.
Mr. Jafra, who funds you?
We don't get regular funding now. We did for 3 years, from 2007 for 3 years. We used to get funding from Home Office, OSCT funding, but now we don't get it. But we do work very closely with Home Office, producing lots of campaign films. One of them was launched in July 2013 by Home Secretary. That is called Families Matter. We showed 3 families whose children have gone to Syria, and one of them was killed, one of them is still there, the other one has come back. So these are the DVDs we produce. We produce quite a number of DVDs from FAST, and there are millions of hits on our DVDs on YouTube. And what we hear, that we came to know that some of the jihadi groups have looked at our DVDs as well. So if we have changed somebody's mind from going to Syria or Iraq, that is our achievement. And we do work very closely with the RICU and Home Office, yes.
I should have said, given you the right of reply, when Mr. Amuna said what a good counsellor you are, that you should have had the chance to comment on his performance as an MP. But we'll leave that for another day.
He's my MP, so I can't say much.
Oh. I'm not sure that's a ringing endorsement.
No, we do work very closely.
Yes,
on
okay.
lots of issues.
I'm sorry I brought that in. Mr. Jawadna.
Thank you, Chairman. As the Chairman says, this committee is aware that young people are being radicalised while not outwardly showing that is the case. So I appreciate that this question might be difficult, but are there any trends at all in your work that have come out that show there are behavioural changes that might not be immediately apparent but are important for us to know about?
Yes, there are some signs we could look for. I have put it on my YouTube page as well, internet page as well, on Families Matter. When they are becoming radicalised, they start challenging their parents and elders for their practice of Islam. They really challenge them, saying, why are you doing that? Why aren't you doing this? And their peer group changes. They don't bring their friends to home anymore. That's what the parents say, that we used to see those young people coming to our house. They don't come to our house anymore. And when they are on the phone or internet, they close their doors. They're not that open. So these are some of the signs we have to look for.
That's very helpful. I guess in which case, actually, there are signs that people need to be made aware of.
Yes.
And what more can be done to make sure people are aware of these signs?
Can I just to provide an alternative? I mean, I think that range of behaviour is also quite typical teenage behaviour, and I think we need to be careful not to assume that something that might be an ordinary stroppy teenager who doesn't want to have anything to do with his parents or her parents is suddenly following a line.
But is it not quite drastic to cut off all of your friends overnight? Because that's what we've just been told.
That's what we heard, that's what families said, and their dress
I'd argue
code.
that isn't.
Their dress code has changed as well, it seems.
Yes. I wouldn't say that necessarily means you're going to become extremist or radical.
Thank you. So, coming on to those points that have been raised, what more can be done to make sure that parents and others are aware that these are potential signs? Let's leave it as that, and say, maybe they should be asking further questions and thinking more carefully about their child's welfare.
What I'm working on nowadays is to encourage parents to have communication, redevelop communications with their children. That is the best way forward for me. They have to be their friends. Don't tell them off all the time. Don't be so much judgmental. Try to understand.
To be fair, that wasn't the question. The question is, how can we make sure they're aware of these signs?
Unless they communicate with their children, they won't know the signs. And
No, my question is, you have said that change of behaviour in terms of friends, dress and so on. How can we make sure that parents know that those are potential signs that they need to be looking out for?
We have put it on our YouTube. These are the signs. It's all there on FAST page, and Families Matter.
Because the trouble I have is Conor Dar said that she still wouldn't know who to turn to for help if worried about a family member being drawn to extremism. So while I don't doubt the good work you're doing, we've still got in this country a problem with people not knowing where to go to get that help, to get the advice and to find out what to do. So from your work, what is the problem here?
Problem is publicity. We do not have resources to publicize ourselves so much. We do our best. Home Office is helping us in our internet page, but how long for we don't know. That's where we say if you have any problems, do contact us. Mm-hmm. It's publicized there. And we have produced few posters as well, and we have sent it to all the mosques in the country to say if you have any issue you want to talk to, please contact FAST. So we are doing our best, but we could do better.
So is there something more that you think that mosques could do, perhaps?
My mosque is doing. I mean, you came to our mosque a few times. In our Friday sermons, khutbah, our imam says things, not every khutbah, but maybe 3 months, 3 months. He talks about the extremism and what Muslims' duties are and where to contact and what to do.
One final question, if I may, Chairman. What factors do you believe make a young person particularly vulnerable to radicalisation? So you've talked about the signs. What do you think are the factors that make young people particularly vulnerable to being radicalised?
I mean, in Tarina's case, wasn't it domestic violence? That's what she said. Just recently, who came in and she was arrested, and she said she was going through domestic violence, so that could be one of the reasons. There was another reason, misunderstanding of the Islamic studies as well, Islamic faith as well. And a lot of young people are being brainwashed.
So what makes them vulnerable to being brainwashed?
Maybe loneliness, not a lot of support, unemployment, lower education, poor housing, all these inner city issues, and a lack of support and valuing young people.
Did you want to add it?
I would say that it's probably a number of different factors. If you look at the last census, 400,000 Muslim men left school without any qualifications. There's underachievement in education, high health inequalities. We also have, at least from 2001, this constant media representation of Muslim communities. And you have a generation of young Muslims growing up where they're seen in a particular way. And I don't think that can be taken out of the mix either. I mean, what does that do to a community of people? And I don't know if there's any research out there that's looking at the kind of psychological effects that might have as well. There was an interview with Hans Blix, I think recently on Al Jazeera, and he said ISIL wouldn't be around if there hadn't been the war in Iraq. Right, but young people pick up on these things, they know these things, so all of these factors I think come into play.
That's really helpful, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chowardner. David Winnick.
Would it not be the case, in some instances at least, we're talking about very few numbers, fortunately, amongst the Muslim population of this country who are addicted to this poisonous evil, but those who are, or could be, are looking for something which they don't find in everyday life. And I ask that because some of the profiles of those who've been involved are people who've led a very Western type of life, in some respects an extreme form of drinking and gambling and so on and so forth. And then what I'm saying, they sort of rediscover their religion, but in a rather warped way. Therefore, they're looking for something which otherwise they haven't found. Do you think it's anything in that theory, Ms. Jaffa?
Maybe belonging. They may be looking for somewhere they belong to. People value them and respect them as well, and give them respect, and they become heroes. Could be that. Because nobody has said one pointer that because of this, people are becoming radicalized. There's no research has done or no answers have been found yet.
Thank you. Vicky Atkins.
You mean... Sorry.
Vicky Atkins.
Sorry. Mr. Mohammed, it's really picking up on something you said at the beginning about government help can sometimes be seen as stigmatising. I just wonder, we've heard this from other witnesses, what is the answer to that? Because we see the good work that FAST is doing, we've heard from organisations like Inspire, and it seems to me that it's a very sad state of affairs if getting a bit of funding from the Home Office would cause some people to turn against what is a very well-meaning project and which will protect their families.
I think the long-term solution for any sort of minority community is to kind of build up its own civil society. I think the danger of being reliant on government funding is that governments change and policies change. And what I certainly have seen of very good organisations, small community organisations who have taken government money, and then that money disappears and they've become reliant on that pot of funding. And then they disappear.
But that's an argument for diversification, isn't it? Which any charity, any organisation needs to diversify its sources of income, whether it's a charity or a business. But it's the idea that because the government is helping a project, that project is therefore deemed
if it's associated,
not acceptable.
If it's associated with something like Prevent is seen as by many sort of educators that I've spoken to, by people in the community, as being a blunt instrument, and that it's not really doing any kind of prevention really, it's an intervention of sorts, And what it's doing is stigmatising whole communities. If you're then associated with a programme like that, it's difficult to create social change on the ground. I remember when we first started setting up Maslaha, one of the first questions I got asked was, are you part of the Prevent programme? Quite openly. And I said no. But that is a question that gets asked. And, you know, so that's been at least since 2007, and there's been different sort of reincarnations of Prevent as well. So,
thank you. David Winnick was...
yes, as far as schools are concerned, do you think that enough is being done by schools to try and detect where there's a possibility, or more than a possibility, that some pupil will engage with ISIS one way or another? Or do you think that's putting too much responsibility on school teachers?
The teachers that I have spoken to have said that there needs to be a positive curriculum response to the Prevent duty. So there isn't a duty right now on them to spot signs of vulnerability, of veering towards radicalisation. From what I understand, what the hour session that they're given doesn't include is what do those teachers do next week on Monday morning in a geography lesson, in an RE lesson, in an English lesson. And there probably is too much emphasis on teachers. There are good organisations like School Linking who are doing work around this, whose attitude I think is the Prevent duty is here, but let's work with it in a positive way. And I think that's missing at the moment. I think teachers need help with that.
Thank you.
Mr. Hubbard, a final question, because other colleagues obviously want to put their questions to you. You spoke about the number of Muslims unemployed, but it is a fact, isn't it, that those who were responsible for 7/7 were pretty well integrated into this country, were not unemployed. That is so, isn't it?
I don't know if they were integrated, if they...
Well, yes, they were certainly employed, or students, as the case were. They didn't seem to be living in deprivation.
No.
And the point is, their justification for the slaughter of 52 people was the Iraq War. There were many people opposed to the war, as we know, the last thing they had on their minds was the slaughter of their fellow citizens. So it was more complex than that, isn't it?
I would argue there must have been other factors involved, whether it's mental health issues, whether it's, again, you know, like I said, the kind of constant media portrayal, and all of these factors coming to play, you know, in one person to do what they did.
One of them did say that he was employed, but he has seen his friends and colleagues were not employed in his communities. So one of them did say that.
Thank you.
In one of his interviews.
Ms. Jaffa, if you could respond to Victoria Atkins' question, I think that she was...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
No, it was just that Ms. Jaffa seemed to want to say something to Mr. Winnick.
About the teachers,
sorry.
yes. About the
right,
teachers.
sorry.
This asking teachers, yes, it is too big a call for them, because I am working in schools nowadays. They need a lot of training to detect, and it can't be just one teacher's responsibility. It has to be cooperative responsibility. It has to be done cooperatively, and they need a lot of training, and it has to be, the theme has to extend it, not just 1 hour session and that's it. And if a young person says something little sentence, they shouldn't be just catching him and saying he's radicalized. There has to be background knowledge. They have to probe into history Indeed. And why they have done it. It's not, to me, it's too quickly done, and there is not a lot of thought behind that.
Thank you. Colleagues, we need to be as brisk as possible, starting with Mr. Lawton.
One of the things that came out in our session in Bradford last week was how those young Muslim people do not trust the media. So where do they go to get trusted information and advice And also building on your point, Ms. Jaffer, earlier, I was surprised you said there was an intergenerational breakdown, which I think there is in society, although ironically, amongst certainly Asian communities, there are probably the strongest intergenerational links still. So where do they get trusted advice and information from, and who's influencing them?
Influence is coming from their peer groups and some of these groups who are brainwashing these young people. And the good influence advice, they take it from schools and teachers and their relations.
Mr. Mohammed, do you think the word brainwashing is very interesting because I think it's come up before. Well, what's your view on the influence of media and why some of those kids seem to be more susceptible then to brainwashing, peer pressure? Mental illness you also mentioned as well, which is another interesting aspect.
So I saw, after your visit to Bradford, there was an article about some of the comments that came out. And reading those comments, I think what I was struck with was those comments I could have heard 8-9 years ago from young people. So I think the mainstream media hasn't changed that much. And I think I've read the evidence from the Times editor, which I didn't think. I think there was something about trying to employ a Muslim journalist who has knowledge of Islamic affairs. And again, I think I heard that 7 or 8 years ago. I think there's such a preponderance of white noise in information that there are a few safe spaces that children can just talk, freely about events that happen. So, teachers have said to us, for instance, after the attacks in Paris, they needed to create a safe space within school where different opinions could be voiced without people feeling afraid. And I think the worry is that might be becoming more restricted, that people feel less confident in being able to express views that people don't agree with.
Because of Prevent?
Because of Prevent. And a teacher said to me just yesterday, actually, that 7 years ago, there may have been a particular cross-section of Muslim society that might have felt as if they were being targeted. Now it feels like it's also the middle-class family who's actually doing okay, who are also feeling that they have to, think about where they go on holiday, think about if one of their daughters decides to wear the hijab, what that means. And I think that's a worry. I think that's a real fear. We had an event at Rich Mix. It's an art centre in East London. And we used an exhibition we had produced a few years ago to explore the idea of dissent being a really strong British value. And we also wanted to discuss Prevent quite openly. And we had some teachers there and students. And the thing that I was struck by was the fear within the audience of speaking quite openly about that and challenging it. And, a couple of people said to me, please don't quote me on Twitter. I mean, that's quite frightening, I think.
Stuart MacDonald and then Naz Shah.
Thank you. We've had a lot of evidence, some today, also last week in Bradford, about the significance and indeed the prevalence of extremist propaganda on the internet. And the young people I was speaking to in Bradford last week, they had all seen some extremist material maybe appearing in their Facebook feed or whatever. Now they would all have the wherewithal to either ignore or even to report that. But how do we ensure that all young people have those skills? Because we're not going to get rid of all this material overnight by any stretch of the imagination. So how do we make sure young people are able to deal with seeing such material?
I think it's... Sorry, did you... I think it's the development of the whole child, and I think it comes back to school again. If room is given within subjects like RE, English, history, to explore what does propaganda mean, and look at historical examples of this, you're then developing children who can be critical rather than just accepting whatever they see. And in that way, it's a far more positive approach, and it's with the rhythm of the school as well. The positive benefits of that are wide-ranging and don't just affect whether or not they're going to see extremist information and be affected by that. There's an interesting article by an ex-British Council director, and he was writing about what was the kind of common factor amongst jihadis in the Middle East and North Africa. And he's putting forward the hypothesis that because they had all studied sort of science subjects, that there was less critical thinking in those subjects, and whether or not studying the social sciences, the arts and English, might have had an effect. And I think there's something about having that critical thinking, and it shouldn't just be focused on Muslims and extremism, just what we're facing, because 15, 20 years' time, there'll be something else. And it's about creating a generation of young people who can be critical.
And also, young people should be given the opportunity to openly discuss what is prevent, why, what is this difference. Nowadays, people are so frightened, they don't even want to discuss or ignore the whole issue. There should be some debate. Let the young people discuss that openly in a healthy environment with some advisors around them so that they understand properly than just listening to someone and believing it. They need to have the opportunity to understand and then know what it is, what is wrong and what is right. We're not giving that opportunity to young people anymore.
Mr. MacDonald? Now, Sean?
Thank you. Am I right in understanding that you did some work around Trojan Horse or post-Trojan Horse in Birmingham? Or have I got the wrong end of the stick?
No, we just that exhibition that I was talking about.
Just the exhibition?
Yeah.
Okay. You've talked about your concerns about the lack of depth, and actually your concern about recommendations would be the same as those of previous years. This is post-Paris, and that they lack depth and were firmly fixed in silos. Could you just expand on that a bit when you say firmly fixed in silos?
Yeah, I would say so. If I take our work in criminal justice, for instance, we a few years ago we created a resource around depression. Now there isn't a word that translates directly, and this was commissioned, and it was for GPs and therapists and communities. Now there isn't a word that translates directly from depression into Urdu, Arabic, Bengali, Sylheti, Punjabi. And with the work that we're doing around the criminal justice system, we know, speak to young people, that there's probably quite a large number of young people who have undiagnosed mental health issues in the criminal justice system. And I think people are too often seen as they're a criminal justice problem, and the mental health issues might be ignored. You know, all the issues around underachievement in education, what was going wrong at ages 11 and 12, that led then down a path that might have ended up in prison. If you look at, there was the Mayor of New York recently appointed his criminal justice team, and they are looking at, I think in 2013, 2014, 55,000 students were suspended from public school, and 1 in 4 of those were black. And they're looking at that with a view to what might that mean for the criminal justice system. And I think that silo, that doesn't tend to happen. I think people tend to just work in. That's what I meant by silo, if that makes sense.
Yep, thank you very much. And your criticism of Prevent and your concerns around Prevent, can you just highlight it? Could you just explain to this committee what do you mean by schools not being prepared or more not enough training for all schools to fully understand and implement the duty?
Again, just speaking to teachers, teachers have said that they've had somebody come in, they've spoken to them for about an hour, but on Monday morning, what does that mean in terms of the curriculum? And I don't necessarily mean just in terms of subjects, but also the whole school environment. What happens during break time and lunchtime. And there isn't enough training given to that. So I would argue, I don't know if it is a prevention program. It's more of an intervention. A prevention program for me would be about, okay, if we're worried about young children not being able to decipher radical, sort of terrorist information, can we run a project in English or history that kind of looks at propaganda from World War II, or that would make sense. But just saying these are the list of vulnerabilities that we have to look out for, I think is just swamping teachers who don't feel confident about this. And the other thing I would say is, I know there have been a few cases of children being interviewed after perhaps saying the word terrorist, and people thought it was terrorist. The knock-on effect on those communities, will last. And I think we need to be kind of cognizant of that. It's not just a one-off incident. That response reverberates throughout communities, and because everything is online, it travels.
Just three very quick questions. One was just in relation to, not directly on the evidence that we've just taken from the social media companies, because I appreciate you both were not here for the duration of the evidence session, but just one quick question. Do you believe that the social media companies, and we've just heard from Twitter, Facebook and Google, but of course there are others, do you believe that they are doing enough to help counter the radicalisation of our young people? And you don't need to give a long answer on it.
To my knowledge, the people I have met with, they have become radicalized because of internet. That's where they got the information. That says a lot. If these social media people were responsible and they were taking into consideration their duties towards communities, they would have done something. That's all I want to say.
When we work on a project, we work with a number of different actors. If it's a health project, it would be therapists, imams, doctors, patients, artists. So it's not just their responsibility. They are part of an ecosystem, and I'm not surprised they don't necessarily know how to tackle those issues. It's not what they're trained to do. It's not what they do every day.
Do you think they could do more?
They could do more, but with a group of people, and I think they need a steer from whatever that group of people looks like.
Okay. Now, can I just ask you, secondly, about some other evidence that we took from Conaka Dar, Siddhartha Dar's sister. And before she gave evidence to us, she wrote a very moving piece in the Sunday Times in May of 2015, where she basically said that she felt a sense of guilt for what had happened to her brother and how he had ended up getting involved in what he had is alleged to have got involved with. But then when she gave evidence to us, she wasn't in a place where she could concede, if you like, if that's probably the wrong word, but I think you get my gist, that he had actually done the things that he had done. And the interesting thing, going to what Ms. Jaffa just talked of, was the fact that many of the families involved here simply don't see or weren't aware of what was happening. I suppose my question to both of you, and this is not my view, so I want it to be taken as a question, is do you think in part why families have found this so hard to deal with is because it's very difficult to accept what it means to see what is happening or to admit what has happened to their young people? So with Ms. Dar, for example, for her to say, actually, what we have seen happened was actually happening under her nose. It's a very hard thing to accept, is it not?
It is denial, really. Yes, there is some denial there, but people are coming to accept that. I am working with families; they are accepting that. But it is, as you said, it is difficult to start with, to accept what is going to happen. And they don't think that their children can do this. They're brought up as such that they cannot. I worked in Brighton with her 3 sons have been killed now. And she still says, how come they did this? How come? She hasn't accepted that they've been killed, they've done all that, they've gone to Syria. She still doesn't accept that.
Indeed.
So,
I think we saw the husband of this particular woman on television saying similar things.
Yes.
Raheel, Mohammed, a very quick answer to Mr. Umuna.
I saw some of the evidence actually, and I think she's obviously it was a very difficult thing to watch.
Yes,
even her giving evidence.
It was a difficult session, I think.
Yeah, and I can't begin to imagine what she must have gone through either. And I think they obviously, and I think you said that she needs some sort of support as well.
Indeed. Thank you. Nusrat Ghani.
There was some recent research that showed that 90 to 95% of people who have been radicalised are radicalised by friends. And Ms. Jaffa, you mentioned this as well, that youngsters are often radicalised by friends, so that we need to get to them much earlier on at school. And then at the same time, he gave some evidence to say school isn't the right place to look out for these signs, which then contradicts the fact when you also mentioned that having good role models in schools is a good thing. And I would argue, just as teachers have to be looking out for kids being groomed for a number of other things, child exploitation, whatever, asking them to look out to make sure that these kids aren't also just being groomed to become radicalised is not a big ask, even though I do appreciate that you believe that the prevent work in this area just has to be much deeper and further. They need more than 1 hour of work, for example.
Yes. I do agree that the schools can play a very vital part in this, stopping people from becoming radicalised, but they need correct and direct training.
They just need more training.
More training. Then they have to be equipped with the tools.
So I don't accept it's a criticism of the prevent strategy, you see. I think it's a good work that the government's doing. It just has to maybe look at it and do it better, as it were.
They have to do it better. I'm not just saying it's wrong.
I don't think the prevent strategy is working at the moment.
Even with helping teachers to look out for...
It's not helping teachers. I mean, I don't think what's happening in schools right now would necessarily help a teacher in any greater way to be able to spot signs of extremism or radicalisation. I think it's just creating an atmosphere of fear. I think the longer term strategy would be, as I said, to develop a more positive school environment that is able to debate some of these really difficult, complex issues in a very safe, open way, rather than what I feel is happening right now is kind of constricting that.
But that is what you'd hope teachers will be doing in schools, having open discussions around what it means to be living in a particular community, what aspirations young boys and girls should have, what their parents' faith is compared to the faith that's being promoted by Daesh, which alludes back to your conversation about parents not being able to communicate with their children because their children aren't practicing the faith that they've practiced for generations. It's a much more extreme conservative form. So it's difficult to have that communication with your children as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's not just on the religion, it's on every aspect of life. Young people are not communicating with in any other society as well as Muslim societies. But because of the problem of language barriers as well, now young people in South Asians and other communities have brought up here, they only speak English and parents may not know English and they don't communicate with each other. So there is a gap of that as well. When I go into families, they say, "Oh, Mum, you don't know much about these things." So
as all teenage children say to their
parents. They
all
say that.
Thank you for that. Let's end with a question relating to the Konakadar evidence session. Following that, I wrote to the Home Secretary asking whether specialist support could be provided to families like the Dar family. And the Home Secretary wrote back to say there are specialist officers involved in CT who are trained to do this kind of work. It would be better, would it not, for organisations like yourselves to be asked to go and see families, to counsel them and to make sure that they were dealing with this incredibly difficult situation. Would you be ready to do that if you were asked to do that? I accept that you don't want to take money from the government because you want to be independent, but if you were called upon, at least one of you don't want to take money from the government. Mr. Mohammed doesn't want to. If you were called upon to be part of that process where it's community trained people rather than CT officers going in to help families, do you think, very quickly, do you think that's something that you'll be up for?
Well, we've created a resource around depression that's been used across the country, but it was made with the user, the service provider, an imam if necessary, other community organisations. So could we do it? Yes, we could do it.
Ms. Java?
I do agree that we are the ones who can go and talk to people, because if city officers go, they don't open up at all. They won't tell them everything. We go as a community members. They speak to us, they open up. We know their issues, we can help them out. I'm doing a lot of work with so many families, the gay family, Nasir's family, I'm working with them, and it helps because we have Islamic scholars as well in our project. She's a woman, and she can sit down with them and say, where does it say jihad means go and killing them?
And one final question. The line that people have to ring, the telephone line, is called the Anti-Terrorism Hotline. And in our last report, we suggested that this should be renamed because we didn't think parents want to ring up the Anti-Terrorism Hotline.
No.
What do you think?
No, please rename that.
Mr. Mohammed?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to that's going to work.
But there could be a resource run by the community with properly trained people who could help people through this situation that is not part of government but semi-detached.
I would say you just need to have a range of different stakeholders involved in making that happen. Can I just say one more thing? Sorry. It would be. I think it'd be really interesting to do a review of Prevent right now in schools. It wouldn't take that long to interview a range of teachers across the country and say what's worked, what hasn't, and what needs to be improved. And I think that would probably be quite an efficient use of, anybody's money.
That is a very interesting suggestion which we will look at. Mr. Mohammed and Ms. Jaffa, thank you very much for coming in today. Thank you. Order, order. That concludes the session.
Portcullis House, the Grimmond Room,